On a dark and quiet night, little Ella, a 10-year-old girl, eagerly awaited her father's return. He had left for a business trip a week ago and hadn't come back. It was common for him to be gone for a few hours, but for him to be gone for days. That had never happened before. As time passed, fear began to creep into Ella's heart. She was alone, and suddenly her large house felt far too big. She sat on her bed, wrapping herself in her small blanket, nervously gazing at the tightly shut door. Ella thought her father would return soon, but she began to hear strange sounds coming from around the house. There was the sound of light footsteps, as though they were creeping out from the shadowy corners. She tried to reassure herself it was probably just her imagination, but the sound felt too real. One evening, as darkness fell and the lights went out due to a power cut, Ella felt her fear escalating. She turned on her flashlight and decided to explore the house, perhaps to calm her heart or to make sure everything was okay. Her small footsteps echoed in the silence as she moved through the rooms, and every corner seemed to hide something unseen. She reached her father's room and slowly opened the door. The room was dark and quiet, as if it were waiting for its owner. Ella saw her father's notebook on the table and cautiously approached it. She opened it and found strange words and drawings she couldn't understand. Some pages were torn, as if someone had tried to hide something. Was her father keeping a secret? And why hadn't he told her why he was gone? As the nights passed, Ella began to hear faint whispers, as if they were coming from the walls themselves. They whispered her name in a voice that sounded like her father's, but it was slightly different, deeper and colder. Ella couldn't sleep, and every strange sound that echoed through the house filled her with an unprecedented terror. Ella remained sitting in the living room, trying to convince herself that everything was okay. But suddenly, she heard footsteps outside the front door. She froze in place. This time, it wasn't just a faint sound or whispers coming from afar. There was someone standing outside the house. She nervously moved toward the door, and before she could look through the small peephole, she saw a shadow of a man standing there, trying to open the door. Her heart began to race, and she ran to the door, locking it tightly. But the man didn't stop. He began knocking slowly, then with increasing force, as if his patience was running out. Ella was about to scream, but she held her breath and stepped back with trembling steps, wondering who this man could be and why he was trying to get in. The knocking continued for a while, then suddenly stopped, and silence settled again. Ella stood still, trying to catch her breath, staring at the door anxiously. For a moment, she thought he had gone, but an overwhelming sense of dread never left her heart. The room was dark, and the stillness was eerily quiet, as though the whole house had decided to stop breathing. Then, suddenly, she noticed a movement in the corner of the room. She turned slowly, and when she looked closer, her blood froze in her veins. There, in the shadows of the corner, stood a pale ghost, smiling a terrifying smile, its cold, icy eyes fixed on her. In a deep, faint voice it said, "You're here, all alone." The ghost's cold laughter grew more terrifying the longer it lasted, as if it echoed through the house, piercing into the very depths of Ella's heart. Her eyes filled with tears, her legs trembling with fear, unable to move. Tears fell as she whispered to herself in a strained voice, "I want my father. I want to get out of here." But the ghost continued to stare at her, laughing its wicked laugh that filled the air, leaving Ella trapped in her fear and isolation, in a house that no longer felt like her safe home. Ella was crying, trembling in the corner, and after the ghost's terrifying laughter faded, she tried to think quickly of how to survive. She remembered the house phone and ran towards it to call the police, but she was shocked when she picked up the receiver and heard only silence. She pressed the buttons and tried several times, but to no avail. The phone was dead, as if the power had been completely cut off. She felt utterly helpless, all alone in this terrifying house. As she searched for another way out, she suddenly heard small footsteps quickly approaching her. She looked behind her anxiously and saw a strange child, not much older than herself, standing there. He was wearing old, torn clothes and holding a sharp knife that glistened in the dark. His face was cold, and his eyes were wide with a terrifying intensity, as if they contained no mercy. Without warning, the child ran toward her, trembling hand gripping the knife, trying to stab her. Ella screamed and ran away, but her heart raced with fear as he drew closer. He chased her around the room like a shadow, and every time she tried to escape, he would corner her and attack. Ella tripped and fell to the ground, trying to crawl away, but the child was faster, grabbing her and trapping her in the corner. Ella screamed, tears filling her eyes, and cried out in a desperate voice, "Why me? What do you want from me?" But the child didn't answer, and there was no expression on his face. Only his eyes fixated coldly on the knife. In the moment he was about to stab her, something strange happened. The ghost suddenly appeared, storming into the room, and with one swift movement, grabbed the child by the shoulder and lifted him high into the air. The child tried to scream, but his voice was silenced, as if his sound had been stolen. Cruelly, the ghost tore the child apart, as though his body were fragile, leaving nothing behind but small, scattered remains on the floor. Ella breathed a sigh of relief, standing up slowly, still trembling with fear. She looked at the ghost and weakly said, "Thank you. You saved me." But the ghost stared at her coldly and said in a chilling tone, "Be careful. Beware of the old woman." Ella shuddered and asked in a fearful voice, "Who is the old woman?" The ghost smiled an icy smile and said, "She's your grandmother, whom your father burned and killed, and no one knew about it." Ella gasped and cried out, her voice hesitant, "But how can you tell me to beware of her when she is dead now?" The ghost laughed a terrifying laugh and said, "She's the one who sent this child to kill your father. She's evil, and she wants revenge." Ella was stunned by his words and asked anxiously, "Is she alive or not?" The ghost looked up as if trying to sense something, then said in a low voice, "She's above the house now, waiting for the right moment to kill you, and she sent the child to kill your father." Ella trembled and said, "But why is she doing this?" The ghost coldly replied, "She's evil, filled with hatred and anger. As for me, I don't like her and I refuse to help her. My goal is only to scare people. I don't want to kill, it's pointless." Before Ella could ask any more questions, the ghost suddenly disappeared, leaving her alone once again, surrounded by the darkness that enveloped the place. She reached out with her trembling hand toward the sharp knife the child had left behind, gripping it tightly, as though she would cling to anything to protect herself. Ella stood there, breathing heavily, the house around her cloaked in terrifying shadows. On that stormy night, as the winds howled through the trees and rain poured heavily, Ella sat on the floor, her eyes fixed on the dark ceiling. There was a strange sound coming from above, rapid rustling noises as though something heavy was moving above her. Her heart was pounding faster, and the sounds grew more intense, making her feel like the walls themselves were about to collapse. Her ears were alert to every movement, every whisper in the air around her. Just as her breath became tight, she heard the same sound again, but louder. It was something heavy, like furniture or something bigger crawling on the ceiling. She quickly raised her head and ran toward the safest corner of the room, breathing hard, wondering if something bigger was threatening her. Those moments felt like the anticipation before a storm. Suddenly, the front door burst open. A strange man entered, wearing a sinister smile on his face, his eyes full of cruelty. He held a sharp knife in his hand and was dressed in tattered black clothes. His hair was long and disheveled, and the features of his face were hidden in the darkness. "Stay away from me!" Ella screamed in terror as she tried to stand and flee. But the man just laughed loudly and wickedly, saying, "I'll take you with me, and you'll be my guest in a better place. I'll kill you, and you won't be able to escape." He moved toward her quickly, his eyes widening with malice. He struck her sharply on the shoulder with the knife, and she felt the intense pain surging through her body as her blood began to spill onto the floor, making her heart tremble. But before he could finish his plan, a young boy, no older than 15, lunged at him from the shadows. he suddenly appeared and grabbed the man from behind, stabbing him in the heart. The man began to scream and resist, but the boy continued to strike him until the man collapsed to the ground, a lifeless corpse lying on the cold tiles. "Don't worry, I'll fix the door. I know how to do it," the boy said, gently placing his hand on Ella's shoulder and helping her to stand. His body was strong and attractive, his eyes filled with confidence. He seemed like someone who had come from another world to protect her, looking at her with a calm smile as if he knew exactly how to help her. Ella was in a state of shock, but she finally felt safe. She saw in him someone who could be a friend, someone capable of protecting her. "I'm James. I was in the street when I saw this man breaking the door. I decided to help you," James said as he continued to skillfully repair the door. But suddenly, a strange child appeared in front of them. He looked pale, with gloomy eyes and dark marks around his eyes, as if he was unaffected by fear. He walked toward the corpse still lying on the floor and smiled a sinister smile. "The old woman will reach you soon. Thanks for the gift," the child said in a calm voice as he lifted the man's body onto his shoulders as if it were a heavy bag. Ella and James exchanged looks, their hearts racing. The mention of the old woman by the child filled them with an unprecedented fear. But James, trying to appear calm, said, "We'll be ready for her." Ella breathed deeply, and her state was better now thanks to James. He seemed like a new hope in her dark world, but at the same time, she knew the danger still surrounded her. This was the beginning of something bigger, something terrifying, but with James by her side, she felt strong enough to face whatever was coming. At that moment, the sound of the storm grew louder outside, and everything around them seemed strange and terrifying. But they were in a battle that had not ended yet, a battle from which they could not escape. Ella moved a little away from James. Her tears had dried, but her heart was still heavy from everything she had been through. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to gather herself before saying what she needed to say. In a calm tone, she began to tell him what had happened. "It all started to change when my dad left that day, and when he didn't come back, I felt something strange in the house. I didn't know what was happening, but I felt that something dangerous was near. After a few days, things started moving on their own, and I began hearing strange sounds. And every time I tried to call the police, I couldn't. The phone was always out of order. Then there was that man who tried to break into the house and chased me. I thought I would never escape this nightmare." Her words flowed out as if she was reliving all the dark details of what she had gone through, while James listened intently. He believed her completely, because he could see it in her eyes and feel how hard and painful everything she had endured was. He gently placed his hand on her head and said, "I'm so sorry for what you've been through, Ella. No one should have to go through that." But at that moment, the power suddenly went out. The place was engulfed in complete darkness, and the sound of moving furniture in the shadows tightened their nerves, as if something invisible was watching them from afar. The terror returned to Ella's eyes, and she began to cry again. The tears that had dried up were now flowing like waterfalls. Her heart sank in her chest, as if she were facing all those fears once more. Without thinking, James moved closer to her and gently took her hands. "Ella, don't be afraid. I'm here with you. I'll always be here. I won't leave you, I promise." Then, without hesitation, he brought his face close to hers and kissed her forehead softly. It was a tender kiss full of reassurance, as if a promise that he would stand by her every moment. Then he embraced her tightly, trying to offer her safety and comfort in that dark moment that surrounded them. "I'm here, and I will never leave you. Things will get better. We'll get through this together," he whispered in her ear, while Ella closed her eyes in his embrace, feeling the peace she had always wished to feel. In that moment, she felt that she was not alone, that someone cared for her and would stay by her side no matter what the circumstances were. She began to feel a gradual calm, despite the darkness that enveloped the place. James's presence gave her a sense of security, as if together they were facing everything in this dark world. In that moment, darkness enveloped the entire place, and the feeling of fear filled the air. Suddenly, the strange child reappeared in the darkness, his wide eyes covered with a terrifying gaze. He was holding a sharp knife in his hand, and his eyes were gleaming with malice and determination. He rushed toward Ella with incredible speed, a deep fear flooding her heart, but James was faster. Without hesitation, James rushed toward the strange child, grabbed him by the coat, and shoved him forcefully into the wall. The wall shattered like glass, and there was no escape for the child. The child trembled, but before he could attack again, James drove another sharp knife into him and pushed with all his strength. In the blink of an eye, the child was destroyed, falling to the ground, shattered, unable to move. But before James could catch his breath, the ghost suddenly appeared before them, in the midst of the pitch-black darkness. He smiled a sinister smile, as if the end was near. "This is the last child from the old woman," the ghost said in a calm voice, but with an underlying threat. "I've completed my task. But beware, the old woman will come at any moment." Ella felt a sense of helplessness, as if she were trapped in this never-ending dark nightmare. "Why don't you help me find her?" she asked weakly, as if she saw hope in the ghost. But at the same time, she knew it was just an illusion. "You don't understand, Ella. The old woman has ghosts like me. They want me to remain neutral, not aggressive. I helped you, but I faced a dark fate because I chose to help you." Suddenly, the ghost's voice changed, becoming more mysterious and terrifying. "The time is now 3 a.m. After this, I will die because I helped you. I will die because the child was going to kill you. So the time is now midnight. You must be careful, for another ghost may appear at any moment." Ella was stunned, unable to speak. She didn't know how to react to all of this, to the feeling that was pulling her toward destruction. But before she could say or do anything, the ghost continued, "Do not trust any other ghost after 2:30 a.m. After that, I won't be able to appear again." Then, just as he appeared, the ghost vanished into the darkness, leaving Ella and James in a state of terror and confusion. Time was passing quickly, and anxiety filled the room's atmosphere. As the clock neared 2:30 a.m., the darkness deepened, and the sounds heightened the terror in Ella's heart. Could she survive? Would James be able to protect her? At 12:30, Ella was sinking into sleep, completely exhausted from all the terrifying events she had experienced. Her face was pale, her eyes tightly shut, but her heart was still filled with fear. She tried to escape her dark thoughts, but everything around her reminded her of the nightmare she had lived. While Ella was asleep, James decided to leave the room for a bit to look for something to eat. He was very hungry, and despite all that was happening around him, his mind insisted on finding something to ease his hunger. When he entered the kitchen, he found himself in a state of shock, as the kitchen was dark except for faint beams of light shining through the windows from outside. As he looked around, he felt something strange in the air, as if there was a shadow moving behind him. Suddenly, James saw something in the corner of the kitchen. There was an old man, extremely thin, hiding among the shadows. His eyes glowed strangely, and his hands were trembling as he tried to find something to eat. But the old man's appearance was terrifying. His face was pale, his bones were protruding, and his bulging eyes widened suddenly at every movement. James felt an odd movement in his heart, as if something in the place was unnatural. He tried to breathe deeply and calmly, but fear began to invade his heart. He wanted to escape, but he was still in a state of shock, and the old man was getting closer and closer. James couldn't take it anymore. He rushed back to the room to find Ella lying on the bed, still immersed in her sleep, but he knew the situation couldn't be endured any longer. He felt a shiver running through his body and remembered the ghost's words. James quietly approached Ella's bed and gently woke her up, saying in a soft voice, "Ella, Ella, wake up. There's an old man in the kitchen. He's really scary." Ella immediately woke up, her heart racing, her bewildered eyes reflecting real fear. She didn't know how to deal with this nightmare that seemed to have no end. James and Ella took a deep breath as they cautiously moved toward the kitchen. Ella held the knife with her trembling hand, her eyes staring into the darkness surrounding them. Everything was eerily quiet, but her heart was racing with fear. James held another knife, ready for whatever might happen. As they entered the kitchen, the old man suddenly stood in front of them. He stood there defiantly, his bulging eyes widening slowly, as if reading their minds. He spoke loudly, "This house is mine. You have no right to be here." Then he quickly raised his foot and struck Ella in the stomach with force. She fell to the ground and screamed in agony, but she clung to the knife she had been holding. In that moment, the old man was distracted by Ella, giving James the opportunity to stab him hard in the chest. James continued to stab violently, while Ella gasped for breath, trying to stand again to face the old man. As the old man staggered and screamed in pain, Ella stabbed him as well, not just because of the blow she had taken, but because she wanted to protect herself and regain her strength. As she stabbed him, the old man groaned and backed away, but he didn't have the strength to resist. In the moment the old man was about to fall to the ground, something unexpected happened. Suddenly, a ghost appeared in front of Ella. It was the ghost of her father. His face was distorted, his eyes full of rage. He spoke to her in a voice filled with bitterness. "You're disgusting. You're a liar. You killed me." The words that came from the ghost's mouth were so painful that Ella's heart clenched as if the entire world had collapsed around her. Her tears began to fall, but before she could respond, the ghost vanished suddenly, leaving Ella in a state of intense shock. Ella began to cry, her tears flowing down her face in anguish. But James, who had never left her side, approached her quietly, gently wiping her tears and saying softly, "I'm here for you. I'm your brother. I'm just like your brother." He then took her into his arms, hugging her with love, as if to say that everything would be okay. As she gasped for breath, trying to calm herself, James moved closer, gently kissed her on the lips to reassure her in that stormy moment she was enduring. "Don't be afraid, Ella. I'm here with you." As Ella cried in James' arms, he tried to comfort her in every way possible. "Everything will be okay, Ella. We just need some time to breathe, to save ourselves from this nightmare," James said softly, reassuringly. After a period of silence, James decided to leave the kitchen with Ella and took her to the living room. They sat together, each taking small bites of food, trying to relieve the pressure in their chests after everything they had been through. The atmosphere was heavy, and as time passed, the tension grew. The strange sounds coming from outside the house made everything even more terrifying. As James watched Ella take a small bite, he said to her, "You need to stay strong. We'll find a way out of this. We just have to be patient." Ella looked at him with tear-filled eyes, but she felt a sense of comfort. Having James with her at that moment was all she needed. But then, suddenly, there was a quiet stillness. The air was charged with fear, so much so that they could almost hear their own heartbeats. Suddenly, in an unexpected moment, the old man they had just stabbed disappeared, as if the earth had swallowed him whole. There was no trace of him left, and no sound. It was a strange moment, and neither of them could explain what had happened. As the tension in the air continued to rise, the strange sound began to echo again, growing stronger. It was as if the house itself was groaning under pressure. But what surprised them even more was the sudden return of electricity. The lights suddenly turned on, filling the rooms with bright light after a long period of complete darkness. The lights flickered for a moment, making James and Ella exchange fearful glances. "What's going on here?" Ella whispered, her eyes scanning the house, trying to find an explanation for this sudden change. But the answer remained elusive, just like everything else in this place. Even James was on edge, yet he tried to reassure Ella, saying, "Maybe the power system is back, but I don't believe it's over yet. Something strange is still happening here." At that moment, the lights began to shine steadily, and the tense, unsettling feeling that had filled the room faded. But there was one thought that lingered in their minds. Even with the power back, nothing was as it had been before. Something in this house had not yet ended.